Everybody. Um, thank you for being here, and welcome to the second session in the Humanities Center's new series on the idea of home. After our opening session last week, and I want to thank Mike Mayer again for a really beautiful talk last week. So after the opening session, in which we looked broadly at the many meanings of home, we turn this week to the history of homes, and offering their reflections on this subject, we have two hugely respected faculty members from USD's College of Arts and Sciences. Ryan Abrecht gained his PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is associate professor and now chair in the Department of History. He is a specialist in ancient Mediterranean history and culture, with a particular emphasis on the history of the Roman Empire. He's written on climate change, violence, and migration in late antiquity, and is a contributor to the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece and Rome. Dr. Abrecht is a great friend of the Humanities Center. He's offered some of our most fascinating and most brilliantly titled seminar classes for our students, my favorite of which is called How to Get Yourself Killed in Antiquity. His latest piece of writing, fresh off the press, is a piece on neighborhood life in Imperial Rome and Han Chang'an. John Bilsel received his PhD from Princeton University and is professor of architecture and art history. He is a specialist in modern architecture, modern housing, museum displays, histories of archaeology, the repatriation of material culture, and the intersections of art, architecture, and politics in Europe and the Middle East. Among many other publications, Dr. Bilsel is the author of the book Antiquity on Display, Regimes of the Authentic in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2012, and he is co-editor with USD's Juliana Maxime of the collection of papers Architecture and the Housing Question, published by Routledge in 2022. He was the founding director of the architecture program here at USD. I mean, it really is a great delight to have you both with us this afternoon. Thank you for offering us your thoughts and your expertise, and therefore please welcome Ryan Abrecht and John Bilsel.
Apologies to those who were here yesterday and have to look at me twice in 1 week. Sometimes I even get sick of myself. I'm just going to help this up. Hopefully it'll do its thing. Sound okay? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, cool. I got a little loopy last night, so. So I'm going to engage with the theme of the history of home by talking about some of the ways that being at home, ancient city dwellers might have experienced. And of course, I'm using the city I know best to do this, which is really a bit of a cheat because Rome was in many ways exceptional, I think, in terms of ancient cities and its size and its complexity. But still, I think the system of urban life that it pioneered is really foundational for sort of modern Western urban living, and it will probably be familiar to many of you, if it's not already, in several ways which will be recognizable as I move through this. So, for example, one of the ways I think Rome might resemble the modern urban experience is the experience of moving to a city and the anonymity and displacement that moving to a big city can entail. When people come to a big place, you know, like London, New York, LA, or some place like that, they come to a place that doesn't feel like home, and doesn't for a long time or may never feel like home, you know? That feeling of newness and exploration is part of the draw, really, of urban life, part of the challenge of urban life. But it raises the question of what does home look like when you're surrounded by strangers, you know? And that's a question, I think, that can help us connect to the distant past because people have asked it since time immemorial, I would say. So the Roman philosopher Seneca, I'm not going to read all this, but you can sort of scan it over. The Roman philosopher Seneca commented on this feeling of excitement and displacement in the 1st century CE. You can see in this quote, he notes many reasons that people want to move to Rome. office or seeking indulgences or love of liberal studies, which is always a good reason to move somewhere. But the thing that I want to call to your attention is that in the second line there, most of the crowd of people that crowd our buildings are people who are deprived of their homelands. So there is a kind of homelessness or a cutting off from your home base when you move to the big city. And later on, a couple of lines down, kind of again reflecting on the many kinds of people who came to Rome, Seneca says, take a roll call of all these people and ask where they come from. You'll see that most of them have left their own homes and come to this very great and beautiful city, but one which is not their own. So I think there's a kind of little crisis of where do I belong when you come to a big place, whether it's a modern large city or an ancient exceptional one like Rome. And you could take this in various directions. I'm going to orient us toward the spatial and the material in this talk rather than the literary or the philosophical, because I think that's next week's topic. I'm going to ask things like, where did all these people live physically when they came to Rome? Where did they find housing, amenities, and community? I think that might have helped them to access a sense of home when they came to Rome. So I'm going to try to focus less on rich, fancy people and more on ordinary people, whatever that might mean. So a significant portion of the population that came to Rome lived in structures called insulae. These, as you can tell from the slide, were multi-story apartment buildings found all over the urban landscape and in other cities too. And here I'll note pretty much every example I'm going to show you comes from not Rome itself, which is built over 1 million times, but from Ostia, Ostia Antica, the ancient port city of Rome, which is an amazing day trip from the city if you are in Italy ever, and is a great archaeological site because it sort of dwindled and was semi-abandoned in the ancient period, so it's still there for us, more or less. So these are Ostian insulae. Insulae were large structures built to accommodate hundreds of residents. They reached heights of up to 6-7 stories. Typically, the lower 2 stories were built of a durable material, brick or stone. The upper floors were wood and plaster, which is why they don't survive. So today, to our eyes, they look fairly short, but they were more like sort of mid-rise, much higher verticality in antiquity. And in fact, get a little reconstructed, imagined image here. Roman architects, most notably Vitruvius in his De Architectura, they noted that due to this sort of crowd of people coming in, it was necessary for the Romans to innovate architecturally and to go up more than they had before, since they couldn't sprawl, though they did also sprawl. And this led to sort of new techniques. So for example, over time, it became more common to build the lower stories, not out of mud brick, but of baked brick or using concrete, so that they could add a few stories up. That kind of evolved into the later versions of these in the imperial period. So this enabled the construction of these sort of large apartment-like block-style complexes, which might look familiar to a lot of modern people, or I think to college students, to be honest. As I was thinking about this, I'm like, these are just dorms, basically, Here's a site plan of an insula block at Ostia, dubbed the garden houses by the archaeologists who did this work. So these garden houses, we can date them. They date to around 130 AD or CE. The bricks are stamped with dates, the construction bricks. And they seem to have been rather luxury, upscale apartments. They were situated along the riverbank in antiquity. The river's since moved, but they were kind of right there in their heyday. What do you see? You see a central courtyard. Those courtyards acted as light wells for inward-facing apartment units, as well as providing fresh air and some recreation. Most importantly, though, in these styles of apartments, the courtyards function as communal space, communal living space, cooking, garden plots, which is where these got their name from, pens for other small animals like chickens, things like this, water basins, that's the squares here, they're all water basins, and altars to the lares, which were the sort of tutelary spirits of the site. They sort of watched over the people who lived in them, communally in this case. Why do you need all these things outside in the courtyard? Because, of course, the majority of units in these sort of rudimentary apartments didn't have water, they didn't have really any facilities, or certainly kitchens. Generally speaking, in these insulae, the lower story apartments were the more desirable ones. You don't really want the walk up. You want to be closer to the street. They tended to be bigger, they tended to have multiple rooms, and they tended to regulate temperature better because they're built of stone, and, of course, heat rises. So in the summer, the top units would bake. The top units tended to be smaller. You might have just a single room apartment, a studio, as we would say, or a cubiculum, as the Romans would say. And these small units, it's a place to sleep and a place to keep your things, a door with a lock on it. It's not really the kind of room you would want to spend a lot of time in, particularly in the summer. It's easy to imagine if you're renting, and rent, I should note, was weekly, so there's a kind of precarity built into that as well. Things could turn at any moment for people who are renting these top units. It's easy to imagine that a lot of people would spend their time outside their apartments, and I'll get into that more in a bit. Even in the nicer apartment blocks like this one might have been, these are intimate living conditions. Again, dorms come to my mind. And Seneca, he commented on this as well. He had a phase where we would say, slummed it. He lived in an apartment complex so that he could write to his philosophical friends about how he could endure anything, even the worst conditions that regular people had to live in. So this is from one of these letters, typical. And here, you see what he says. From his apartment, he rented over a bathhouse. He could hear pickpockets being arrested and someone who likes to sing in the shower or something like that. People who splash in the baths too loudly. Some people have good voices, but you hear the hair plucker with his penetrating, shrill shout, never holding his tongue except when he's plucking the armpits and making his victim yell. Yeah, right? I know. And the cake seller, the sausage man, the confectioner, and all the vendors of food, each with their own distinctive intonation. So you get this soundscape where there's not a lot of quiet repose in even a nice apartment in Rome. Quiet was a luxury even in luxury complexes. And so he's probably exaggerating for his philosophical flex, if you want. But we also have corroborating evidence. There's Roman laws passed from around this period that try to prohibit or restrict cart traffic on the streets to only a few hours around dusk because there's this constant rattling and sounds of animals that are keeping people up all night. Other ancient writers commented on the smells that you'd encounter living in these places, and I'll get to that more in a bit, so don't worry. Insulae were typically built quickly and on the cheap. And here I should also note that there's kind of an absence of any clear indication of building codes in Roman law. So they were pretty dangerous, basically. Contractors would sort of throw them up and they might not last for very long. Among many ancient writers comment on the danger of living in these apartment blocks. This is a satirist, Juvenal, sort of late 1st, 2nd century satirist. And you can see how he describes them. Unsteady, dangerous structures held up by slender props. The landlord patching gaps in the wall with plaster, bidding the inmates, that's what he means for residents, right? The inmates sleep with one eye open, wondering whether the roof will come down on them, right? Again, some exaggeration, but we know that these things did collapse regularly, and Italy is quite a seismically active area. So the top stories could easily come down. In fact, that garden complex I showed you a second ago was destroyed, all of it, in an earthquake about 150 years, 125 years after its building. So pretty common occurrence. Where there's earthquake, there is fire, of course, always in a pre-modern society and in modern societies. And in a world lit and heated only by many small oil lamps and charcoal braziers, this is always a risk. So there are notorious fire traps, a lot of these apartments. And a lot of people commented on this. Strabo here in his geography, he even suggests that landlords maybe would welcome such disasters if the whole building can burn down and you can build anew rather than constantly having to patch up some tired old ship. Not a lot of recourse for renters in a society like this. So you get the idea. They're not great. I think in a society like this, in a sort of urban framework like this, it's likely that most renters, as I said, spent their time on the street, on the sidewalks, and in public spaces. And I mean, we're San Diegans, so we kind of know this. In a Mediterranean climate, you can do this pretty well for most of the year, and it can be pretty comfortable. In a Roman city, the streets had a lot to offer, too, in terms of amenities, but also in terms of community, I think. So here, you see a nicely preserved street in Ostia Antica. These large rectangular openings here are entrances to tabernae. Tabernae were they're basically just square blocks, square rooms, single room, square units found on the ground floor of pretty much all of these apartment complexes. And as the caption indicates, these served as stores, restaurants, service providers, barber, tailor, whatever you need down in these units. And of course, with apartments above them, it's mixed-use housing, I think we would say today. Workshops for craftsmen and artisans as well, all down here. So maybe there's a jeweler working in one in a nice complex. All of this is really well documented for us, the uses of these spaces. We have a lot of inscriptions, a lot of them funerary inscriptions by people who did this work for their living that depict them in their places of work. So top left, a cutlery seller. Bottom left, vegetables. This really gorgeous one here selling basically pillows and cushions, right? This is kind of the world of work. And it was ubiquitous in these sort of mixed-use living situations. They needed to be because they provided crucial services for people to kind of live in these spaces. But I think they also functioned as sort of hubs of community. I mean, you would visit these places day in and day out and see the same people. This is where you encounter folks, you know. And something else which is kind of interesting about these, they're essentially square boxes, right? You'd have a counter facing the street. You'd have, if you go back here, sort of a sliding wooden door that would close this off. But if you look at even poorly preserved tabernae, you see this thing on the lower right? It's a staircase, or a piece of a staircase. And you see those holes in the wall, of course, as my caption indicates. They're support beams for an attic or a loft. That's where you would store extra stock if you're in a store, but it's very likely that people also slept here. It makes a lot of sense, right? If it's easier to sleep upstairs in the loft and not worry at night about who's going to break in and steal your goods and not pay double rent, just do that. So for a lot of folks, I think, working class people, we might say the business is also home, you know? And the people you encounter in coming into your business are kind of part of your home life in a way, though they're also your customers. Kind of nice in a way. Obviously, the Latin word taberna gives us the modern tavern, and some of these spaces kind of functioned in a way analogous to modern bars or restaurants. This is a really nicely preserved and partially reconstructed taberna at Ostia as well. And it's pretty recognizable to us. I mean, there's areas for seating. There's a serving counter there on the left that also opens up to the street. There's this fresco discovered. It wasn't discovered in this place, but they sort of created this sort of shelf fireplace-looking thing. That seems to offer what this place had available. There's food, drink, and music. It's kind of, what else could you need, right? And behind the perspective of the person taking this picture, there's a storage area with big vats set into the floor for probably wine, olive oil, commodities, basically. This is a place maybe where locals would spend their evenings. Maybe some social connections could be forged. If it may be a stretch, but this is the Roman equivalent of a pub, perhaps. And although we don't really have good sources that let us fully see kind of like Roman pub culture or anything like that, we do have occasional finger-wagging, moralizing comments from upper-class Romans like Cicero, who kind of tisk about gambling and carousing and drinking that goes on in seedier tabernae. He uses this term. So we can imagine, I think. We've all been in these places. I hope we've all been in these places. So here again, a kind of a hub of community, perhaps, attached to these living spaces. And then there were places that you could just pull up a chair at. Maybe you've seen images like this before. Maybe you've been to Pompeii or Ostia. Here, just imagine stools on a vanished sidewalk and people pulling up to a counter to have a quick bite, a thermopolium, sort of fast food, Roman style. And here again, imagine pottery vessels sort of underneath these holes in the counter where you could draw something up quickly, maybe hot wine in winter, something different seasonally. Picture kind of something like this. So quick chat, and then you move on. So these, I think, are pieces that can maybe create a sense of home. You know, everyone has their favorite spot, perhaps. Here's a site plan of Ostia, kind of easy to work with site plan. And you'll notice there's a lot of baths. There are regularly spaced wells. There's things like this. There are what sometimes the scholarship calls nodes or hubs in the urban network. The structure of the city kind of required this because there's amenities needed by many people who don't don't have them on their own. And I think that it's at hubs, nodes, whatever you want to call them, that people, again, kind of built habits and encountered the idea of home because they would see each other. I also think the proximity to something useful, to a well or something like that, helps carve out the boundaries of your neighborhood in your mind. You know, this is the one I go to. This is the bath that I tend to visit. And it's those little slices of the city that make you feel like a local, you know? So let me show you a few examples. We could do it kind of quiz style. Anybody know what this is? I want to take a guess? I just came from class, so I'm in that mode. Don't be scared. I know it's just an LLC, but it's okay. Take a guess? Did someone say a well? Yes. See? Fortune favors the brave, right? Yeah, it's a public fountain. Public fountain, almost always found alongside a street, often at an intersection for convenience. When you think about a fountain or a well, you think about daily visits. You think about morning greetings, maybe. People hanging around to see who just might walk by during the middle of the day. You think about panhandling, because you better bet people will be coming by, and that's useful if you're looking for quick buck. You think about kind of quick connections, but quick daily connections. How about this? Any guesses? Yeah, it's a bath, exactly. Nice. The so-called Bath of the Seven Sages at Ostia. A nice one, too. You think about a bath, and you think, of course, the Romans were great bathers, you know. You think about maybe more leisurely afternoon visits. You think about seeing people naked all the time, which is quite outside of our daily experience, but does build a kind of intimacy with people that you see regularly. You think about longer conversations with people. This is called the Baths of the Seven Sages because there are frescoes there that depict the philosophers and sages of ancient Greece. So perhaps an elevated, educated clientele. You think about maybe recognizing the regular bath attendant or owner, because many of these were privately owned. There is a mosaic found at this site that shows the likeness of a man, and the caption is, "Here one sees the likeness of Julius Cardius." We don't know who he is. It's not a famous name. He might have been the owner who put his face on the wall as you come in. So maybe slightly longer connections. And then, of course, what's this? Yeah, everyone loves this one. What do you not see here? Partitions. Yeah. So maybe you'd rather not think about it, but imagine bonding with your neighbor while sharing a couple of these seats, right? Maybe laughing with them or at them at an inopportune moment. You know, we don't need to spend too long here, but the Romans did love scatological humor, no question. In fact, back here at the baths, there's several graffiti that are bathroom jokes making fun of ancient Greek sages. So, Visere takite kailon dokuit subdulis. The cunning Kailon, a sage, taught how to flatulate unnoticed. Right? So, I mean, it's not where I would prefer to make my social connections, but it probably happened, you know? So all these amenities, I think, can build community, build a sense of home, maybe, out of strangers. And another place where in a city like Rome or Ostia we might find something related to the idea of home is the workplace. And I've already mentioned this with the tabernae and owners who might live there or stay sometimes in the loft. This, I think, is relatable to us. I mean, many Americans feel like they live at work, and I think the work community that you build is important to you. You feel like you have a home at USD in a way. I do. So these are warehouses. Ostia was a port town, a place where ships came in regularly from all over the Mediterranean, bringing millions and millions of tons of grain and olive oil and wine and building materials to feed and build Rome. That cargo was offloaded from ships, put into these buildings, stored and sorted, and then again sort of loaded onto barges and sent up the Tiber River. It's about 15 miles, or carted on roads alongside the Via Ostiensis going up with animal labor. There's about 20 of these in Ostia that have survived. They're, again, just great big square boxes, like 80 by 90 meters or so. lined in the interior with storage units. They were worked by a mixture of slaves and freedmen who made their livings just loading and unloading goods. And, you can imagine some of this work day in, day out, heavy labor. This is the Horea Epigatiana, which was owned by two freedmen, former slaves. We have their names. There's an inscription naming them. Built in the 2nd century AD, and it may have rented out. It may have been like a storage unit that people could rent pieces of. There were a lot of locks found on the interior units, suggesting sort of high-value goods, perhaps. Just to give a sense of how amazing archaeology is, this is what it looked like before excavation in the 1920s. And this is what it looks like on the interior now. Not bad, right? So you kind of picture people sort of coming in and out, hustle bustle, day in, day out. Those shrines on the wall are for the lares, the protective spirits of the site. It's not glamorous, right? This is the Roman equivalent of an Amazon distribution center. But that's also a window into a world of work that was essential for the city's survival, and I think for maybe the hub of some people's lives. Any of you see Nomadland, that film? It was hard to watch. It's a beautiful but tough movie, but she spends time, she makes these connections at an Amazon distribution center. It's a bunch of strangers, and she kind of bonds. That was in my head when I was putting this together. One more I'll show you. This is a fullery. It's a place where clothes were cleaned. There's 7 of them at Ostia that have been excavated. Those large basins are for soaking and cleaning clothes. There's other areas for stamping and pressing to get them clean and dry. Fullery is very much not glamorous. Does anyone know how the Romans kept their togas so white? Florence knows, yeah. How?
They collected urine.
Yes, with urine. Quite right, which has natural bleaching properties, among other things too, fuller's earth. But yes, urine. So not the best job in the world. You know what I mean? Not a glamorous job. Remember I mentioned smells before? You don't really want to live next to a fullery, and yet they didn't really zone these things out. I mean, they could be downstairs from an apartment. Imagine, there's no glass in those windows, folks, you know? So not great. The workers suffered certainly all sorts of health problems, bacterial, fungal infections. You're breathing in sulfurous fumes. It's not great. And yet, we know that fullers had a collegium. They had a sort of guild. They had a patron goddess. Minerva was the patron goddess of laundry workers because she's associated with textile production, spinning. And I think maybe it's a stretch, but I think you can glimpse a sense of community, even among people with pretty bad jobs here. Maybe only based on shared identity and sort of common experience, common suffering, right? But check this out. This is another graffito found at one of the fulleries in Ostia. This is what it says, and I want praise for my connection to the Aeneid from the Humanities Center director. It says, Fulones ulalamque cano non arma virum, with a que implied. I sing of fullers and the owl, not of arms and the man. Why is that a connection to the Aeneid? I won't quiz you, Brian, but that is a riff on the first line of the Aeneid, arma virumque cano. I sing of arms and the man. That's the Romans' national epic, of course. A very elevated epic text, full of patriotic themes and destiny of Rome. Someone at this place is riffing on it. And they've pushed Aeneas, the hero, off the stage, and they put themselves, the laundromat workers, on stage. They sing of the owl because, of course, the owl is Minerva's sort of totemic animal. So that's just great. I love that stuff because someone's having a little fun here, or maybe making mockery, but we're kind of in on the joke. It suggests a degree of literacy, cultural literacy. These people are familiar with at least a little bit of the Aeneid. Someone here is. And there seems to be a kind of sense of pride here among people who worked in this rather unpleasant place. I'm going to wrap up, but that's a good reminder that in Roman cities, the walls often speak to us. Graffiti are everywhere, suggesting interesting things about literacy levels, perhaps, but also another type of community that we might identify with the idea of home. I'll show you just a few. I love graffiti. They're a great source for social history and I find them very humanizing. So here's just a collection. These are from Pompeii, so I'm cheating at the end, but whatever. It's my talk. Gaius Julius Polybius for Edile. He'll get you good bread. May all who refuse to vote for Quintius be turned into a donkey. Why not, right? Publius Comicus Restitutus stood right here with his brother. Would someone like to invite me to dinner? I love that one. There's no number left. There's no name. Just please. I like this one too. Epaphra, you are bald, right? See, that I really like because hopefully they're thinking that that person would see it, you know? This is gross, but Apollinaris, the physician of the Emperor Titus, a great title, defecated well here. I told you they love bathroom humor. Congratulations, dude. Secundus says hello to his prima, wherever she is. I ask my mistress that you love me. And then a sort of meta commentary. Oh, walls, you've held up so much tedious graffiti that I'm amazed you haven't already collapsed in ruin, right? There's a lot of this stuff. And, you know, I think if we can sense a little hint of familiarity with the people who scratched these onto walls 2,000 years ago across time, I think we can imagine that at least some of them felt some shared familiarity with each other, cohabitating in this space even across a couple generations. And sometimes these things talk to each other. There's a few that they respond the way graffiti do now. You go into any bathroom and you see it. So all of these are the little fragmentary pieces that maybe suggest an idea of home that might form among strangers in an ancient city like Rome or Ostia. Sometimes that's as close as we can get, but that's what I can offer here today. I'm not going to talk about rich people and fancy houses. That's where you thought I was going to go, but no. But if you want to know about rich people and fancy houses, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation and really extraordinary lecture. Thanks so much. So, have you seen The Brutalist, the movie? Okay, spoiler alert. Leave right now. No. I watched it in panic with this like obsession that my students will see it and ask me questions about it. But I realized that at 200 minutes, it's not TikTok compatible. Even though there are some kind of memes going around, like between engineer and the architect. But basically, this whole idea of basically the arrival of modernism, architectural modernism to America, is done in the hands of this deranged genius, because a good architect needs to be a deranged genius. And what else? I mean, I was like really speechless, like because the patrons were even worse. They were sociopaths, right? So this is my spoiler. I'm going to stop on this one. But I was also kind of taken aback about the misogyny of this entire thing. And so I started thinking, like, okay, if I'm going to talk about one single figure who's not a fake, algorithmically plausible figure like Laszlo, character of the movie, but a real person, who would I choose to describe basically relate the experience of modernism and also migration and arrival? So I end up by just like picking Margareta Schutte-Liotsky, because there's so much new, exciting research being published or is about to be published about her. So I want to talk about the itinerant architectures of Liotsky, gender, labor, resistance. Okay. So in 1925, the Austrian architect Margaret Schutte-Liotsky, then only 28-year-old, arrived in Frankfurt, Germany. She was invited by Ernst May, the director of Frankfurt Center Building Authority, to join a small group of designers working on public housing projects, also known as the New Frankfurt Initiative, or basically the housing estates, in German Siedlungen. So, Anne Smay's new Frankfurt initiative, and here you see an aerial view of it. It's a workers' colony. Design and build much needed housing for the workers under the social democratic city governments. And the new Frankfurt provided a testing ground for rational, standardized, and basically prefabricated housing with an eye on mass production. So everything was basically rationalized, from a doorknob to basically larger construction methods to basically the graphics advertising it. So in the course of 5 short years, so here's a idea of the mass production of it through these prefabricated slabs. So in the course of 5 years, basically, New Frankfurt produced housing for 60,000 inhabitants, or for about 1/10 of the city's population. This adds up to 15,000 units in 14 settlements. Only in Berlin, more social housing was built in the interwar period. So here you see a lithograph of the Praunheim estate, one of the earlier ones, also one of the fanciest ones. It is basically a garden city, but at the same time, what we would call today, I guess, a mass housing project. It's compared to other ones, quite luxurious. So here is basically the floor plan of basically one of the Praunheim earlier types. I started like marking the kitchens because, as you will see, I'm absolutely obsessed with kitchen these days. At home too. But, okay. Modern apartment living, typically a 2-bedroom apartment and prefabricated fitted kitchen, meant that the new household came to be confined to a nuclear family with prescribed gender roles. Architectural historian Susan Henderson argued that the rise of the new woman, politically franchised and sexually liberated, was met with great anxiety in the City Council of Frankfurt. Conservatives and socialists alike, they feared for the future of family life. Conservatives, because they are conservatives, and socialists, because they are men. So during the Weimar Republic, women constituted 35% of the German workforce. A significant percentage of working women lived outside of nuclear family and looked for housing. It was thanks to the efforts of Social Democratic City Council member Elsa Bauer that basically alternative solutions were explored. Grete Liotsky and her colleagues designed units for single women. So she's the only woman in the team, but she's not the only one designing like basically alternative solutions for a single professional woman. So in 1927, Liotsky presented 4 apartment types to women members of the city council, each for a different income level. Here, for example, you see type 3, which was intended for white-collar professional women. It is what today we would call a studio apartment. Instead of subdividing the floor here into multiple rooms, Liotsky grouped functional niches for the bathroom and for the kitchenette around the central integrated living and bedroom space. So she was basically following the principles of American Taylorism as applied in the works of American domestic engineer Christine Frederick, to whom I'm going to return shortly. So Liotsky reduced the space allocated to circulation into a bare minimum, which also required that there was absolutely no privacy of any sort. Because if you get rid of the circulation corridors, that's what's going to happen. The unit for professional women had a footprint of 18 by 18 feet, about 320 square feet, and occupied the precious top floor of a housing block. A narrow balcony that runs across the facade allowed professional single women to enjoy to participate in and to be visible, very important, to be visible in public life. The design for professional women was in many ways groundbreaking, showing how architecture can facilitate women's emancipation. Curiously, however, whereas Lihotzky's and her colleagues' design for single professional women are hardly remembered today, and it's not picked up by Hollywood, hardly remembered, other than architectural historians like me who are into this. Grete Lihotzky became a celebrity for her design of the Frankfurt kitchen for Ernst May's housing projects. Okay. So here, between 1926 and 1931, the Frankfurt City Council installed as many as 10,000 of these fitted kitchens in public housing units. Here, for example, you see another rather well designed and quite luxurious estate, Römerstadt estate housing plan. And here, my obsession with the kitchens. Right, kitchens is all that matters. Okay, and so in a commonly applied version in the Römerstadt housing estate, the kitchen was reduced into an incredible 1.9 meter by 3.4 meters, which is like slightly bigger than 6 by 11, right? If you live in Carmel Valley, first of all, congratulations. And secondly, it's probably smaller than walk-in closet, right? So here's the point that I want to make about that. I think the Frankfurt kitchen was less a design object than a series of rules that govern placement, utility, and motion to achieve maximum efficiency in minimum space. Storage, appliances, workspaces, plumbing were coordinated through the science of ergonomics and motion studies that assumed that the kitchen would be used primarily by a woman performing a series of predetermined tasks and without help, so no husband holding the towel or anything. One could easily subtract an appliance and add another without disrupting the functioning of the integrated system. As far as I know, there's no fridge, which is a huge missing thing in the kitchen. I mean, and when they came, they went straight to the slide where the sliding door is. So when they came, where is my kitchen? Sorry, I lost my kitchen. So when you see basically a sliding door to the left next to the stove, that's where usually the added fridges go. So the innovation that is most commonly attributed by the museum catalogs, like for example the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art catalog, to Schutte-Liotzky, is the revelation that a compact and well-arranged kitchen is more efficient than a large one. Well, this one has a long history, especially in home economics in America. The principles of household management as domestic space, as domestic science, goes back to mid-19th century work of Catherine Beecher, The American Woman's Home. I have the 1869 version. But this is the work that I find really, really important. So it's not the first one, but it is really quite a groundbreaking one. The publication in 1913 of Christine Frederick's New Housekeeping Efficiency Studies in Home Management had an unprecedented international impact, leading to numerous translations and similar copycat works written by designers, architects, and aspiring home economists. So we know that Schutte-Liotzky was in contact and had access to Irene Witte's German translation of the 1921. In fact, Witte's translation of Christine Frederick's book has even a more ambitious title called The Rational Household Management. So much of the rational management of home is about how the kitchen functions and the order of repetitive motions that take place there. Here you see a diagram drawn by Christine Frederick, American New Housekeeping Efficiency Studies self-made expert. So on the left, it is an inappropriate, badly arranged kitchen, because while clearing and serving food, you're just like making conflicting movements. Whereas the one on the right, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful, clear diagram where nobody's interrupting your dispatch to be. And so you can just like serve. You can cut like 15 minutes out of the 45-minute period. So all these Taylorist things, like, for example, motion studies, incentives for the kitchen helpers, all these things are somehow in the book. Yet it seems to me that Christine Frederick's contribution was not merely an application. Here it is. It's not only an application of the American engineer Frederick Taylor's scientific management method to home economics. The translation from the factory to the kitchen had been tried many times, and it's probably not possible because basically a home doesn't match the division of labor and complexity of a factory. Ultimately, Christine Frederick transformed her own kitchen in Long Island into what she called Applecroft Efficiency Kitchen, or Efficiency Station. Her kitchen served as a lab for testing appliances and housekeeping consumer products. It works a bit like today's New York Times wire cutter. So somebody is like testing your mattress before you expose your body to it, which is like so great. Frederick insists that Applecroft kitchen here is neither a model kitchen nor a prototype for mass production. It is here that Christine Frederick differs from European modernists, including Lihotzky, in the way they understood American Taylorism. I suspect that the appeal of Christine Frederick to her American audiences was not so much the promise of increased productivity. Here it is like baby's bath, 15 minutes, together with mixed layer cake, followed by ice layer cake, followed by salad dressing. Like, what happened to the baby? I don't know. Right. And so I think the appeal is rather self-help customization. For example, when the sink drops too low and poorly built, she says, raise it by 2 inches with a strainer. There is a sliding scale of countertop heights proportional to housewife's height. She increases not production, but consumption. And she has this difference that she talks about standard practice versus standardizing conditions. I used to know this, but I forgot. It's something. The crux of the matter is domestic labor and who controls it and pays for it. There is hardly a text as class-conscious as Frederick's New Housekeeping, for whom it is written is clear. Not the rich, not the poor, those women in the middle, the professor's wife, who need to keep up with appearances while also managing a middle-class household with only 1 or 2 maids, or, God forbid, sometimes no maid at all. Race is never mentioned, actually, as far as I know, in Frederick's work. So Frederick writes, according to figures compiled by Business Bourse, I checked that, it is her husband's company, it's in sales, there are 1,677,000 families in the country employing domestic help, while there are 19 million families in America keeping house. In other words, only 8% of the families in the United States keep domestic help. So reading Frederick, I mean, I started Margaret Schutel-Liotsky and I got like redirected to Frederick because she's so fascinating. One of the things that I love about her is that when she gets a very, very smart idea, she basically invites one of the husband's smart engineer friends home and she attributes everything to him. because I think it's less threatening. So she goes, after Mr. Watson's talk on efficiency, I began to consider this middle class to which I belong and whose difficulties I face every day, unquote. Okay, to sum up, I have to let Christine Friedrich go at some point. Christine Friedrich's new housekeeping served as a catalyst, especially in Europe, interestingly. Middle-class women actually become professional housewives, meaning both home managers and laborers. I think it's Christine Friedrich's fault that, it became the woman's job to do the kitchen work. No, not true, but to a extent. So Grete Lihotzky, the architect, she was critical of the way her career came to be defined by this early design project, which is paradoxical because she broke the glass ceiling by basically proving her knowledge of American household management to Anne Smay, who was incredibly impressed that basically this woman can bring us Taylorism. And yet she is defined by it. She becomes the woman that who designs the kitchens of the mass housing projects. And she's going to say later in life, quote, "Had I known everyone would talk about it and nothing else, I would have never designed that damned kitchen." Unquote. And she also wanted everybody to know that she never cooked before or after Frankfurt Kitchen. So something that I'm also discovering, so you might know this much better than I do, but I thought it was interesting that the evolution of women's movement during Lihotzky's lifetime might be a factor in this transformation of Frankfurt Kitchen for her, something progressive to something rather oppressive. The wages for a housework movement that took off in New York in 1970s called into question basically the entire Christine Friedrich enterprise, because they basically said, and I think that might be true, there is absolutely no evidence that increased efficiency in the household would give women any more leisure time. You go and get another job, I guess. But I'm very proud of reading this literature. When I asked Juliana about it, she asked me, what took you too long? So long. But I am reading, okay. But an interesting reference here in her history of feminist design for American homes, The Grand Domestic Revolution, Dolores Hayden describes Christine Friedrich as a contributor to anti-feminist backlash because the dominance of self-appointed efficiency experts made it difficult to explore alternative models of architecture, like, for example, cooperative housekeeping. Interestingly, Grete Lihotzky, the architect who's the creator of the most iconic modern kitchen, has been mostly spared of this criticism, in part thanks to the remarkable career and itinerary. In 1931, Lihotzky was the only woman among 17 experts that followed Anne Smay from Germany to USSR. And I am still only starting to look at this, but in Magnitogorsk, I believe that's in Siberia, she collaborated on kindergarten designs with her husband, also part of the same team, Wilhelm Schütte. I learned quite a bit about this period, however. So then comes a period of nearly 3 years of political exile in Turkey, exile because Austria is now occupied by the Nazi Germany, or rather unified with Nazi Germany. And like a number of German-speaking intellectuals and artists, she is in exile with her husband in Istanbul. As a member of Architecture Office of Istanbul Fine Arts Academy, she was commissioned to design village schools for the Turkish Department of Education. So thanks to the archival research of Ali Cengiz Khan, we have a good record of these projects. Unlike her work on standardization back in Germany, these designs are also kind of rationalized in the sense that this is for a particular climate and a school for 180 students in the village in Anatolian countryside. And yet there is difference because she is rationalizing it, but standardization of production is impossible. So most of these school designs are meant for self-help building by basically villagers themselves. There is also an interesting political context in Turkey in 1920s and 30s. That's the time of the Turkish Republican Revolution. So there is basically women's emancipation from the old Islamic ways of living or old Ottoman ways of living that is being shown as basically both in this kind of interestingly embrace of Christine Frederick's ideals of housekeeping taught in girls' institutes, but then more so symbolic presentation of women doing like basically pioneering avant-garde jobs. Like, for example, Sabiha Gökçen here, who's shown in 1937, more or less the year when Şütelyotski arrives in Turkey as the first fighting pilot of Turkey. Istanbul's second airport on the Asian side is called after her. While in Turkey, Şütelyotski joined the secret Austrian Communist Party that is led by basically the emigres that are in exile in Turkey. She was sent to Vienna to help organize the resistance against the Nazi regime. Shortly after she arrived in Vienna, she was captured by the Gestapo. So she's quite an ordeal. She spent 4 years in prison, first in Vienna and then in a labor camp in southern Germany. So Grete Liotsky lived past the age of 100. Her memoirs of resistance appeared in her 80s. Her memoirs, How Did I Become an Architect, was published in Germany posthumously. So formally marginalized and tokenized in the discipline, she is celebrated as a pioneering modernist architect today. And a vibrant culture of Şütelyotski studies emerge in architecture. Many books and articles are either published or they are in the works. It takes scholars of international reading competency to cobble together the evidence. So you need to read Russian, you need to read Chinese. I mean, of course, different people do this. You need to read Turkish, you need to read German. To trace a career that extended from Austria to Germany, to USSR, to Turkey, and in the post-war era to Bulgaria, China, DDR, back to Austria. So I give more space to Grete Liotsky in my survey of history of modern architecture classes. This was the very first architecture class that actually we developed at USD. And now I have the pleasure that a number of colleagues are teaching so many versions of it. It's one of the humanities courses that is taught most, actually. I'm preparing, I want to say that I prepared all this material just for you, but it's going to become a class, especially in the seminar that we are co-teaching together with Professor Molly McLean of History Department. So basically, I'm preparing this material for a 2-session, full-week discussion with readings by students. So in other words, I'm not trying to make an argument as much as trying to provide openings that students can follow as they are interested. But I want to reflect on some of the challenges, but also the joys of teaching in this fast-evolving field. Many of the recent studies on Grete Liotsky follow a traditional life and work of the great artist model, which assumes that there is an inviolable unity and interiority to the person. The architect was an author. She made tough choices in tough political circumstances. She decided to resist authoritarian fascism. She could have stayed in exile. She decided to go back to Austria, and she paid a price for it. Yet the architect is not only an author, and the modern home is not only an idea that traveled with her. I call the itinerant architectures of Grete Liotsky to refer to the human and non-human assemblages and their circulations that added up to modernism in different places. I think of her as another catalyst for social change with complex assemblages of international modernism. So in his History of American Architecture, Modernism's Visible Hand, my colleague, friend from UCLA, Michael Osman writes, and I quote, modernism did not materialize in buildings as the embodiment of an idea about a new society. Rather, it was constructed through intersections of management with technology and physical infrastructure that operated on environment and the economy to constrain the errors and deviations of endemic to a society invested in growth. This is perfect because he perfectly describes what Christine Friedrich is all about. Correcting the deviations is what modernism is about, this balance. Michael Osman also writes that, quote, this is not a history of enthusiastic people doing interesting things. Instead, it investigates kind of activities that Joseph Conrad understood as, quote, taking a modern steamship around the world, unquote. But I want to know what happened when that steamship of modernism crossed the oceans and anchored in foreign ports. How did Taylorism, the American gospel of efficiency, made its way to German social housing in the hands of a feminist architect and a member of the Austrian Communist Party? So I couldn't have thought about any more different people than Christine Friedrich and Grete Liotsky when it comes to politics. And how did the practice of American Taylorism and German social democratic housing assisted the Turkish Republican Revolution project of village enlightenment? I'm almost done, but here is one more episode. What I find fascinating about Grete Liotsky, and this I owe to the recent research of my colleague, Essie Eisterer, when Liotsky was arrested and imprisoned by Vienna by the Gestapo, her task becomes the opposite of self-expressing, so self-revealing architect. She is trained to hide her network. If Grete Liotsky emerged as a leading figure to her interrogators, just like many of her companions, her chances of survival would have been slim. So after she was liberated, Liotsky drew a map of the 4th floor of the Gestapo prison in Vienna out of memory. She registered the names of women prisoners on their cells to be published in the Memoirs of Resistance. One of these women she called Vera, covertly referring to her close friend, the Chilean architect Victoria Meyer. According to Eisterer, the resistance fighters stood in solidarity with one another, communicating with one another with basic Morse code, and other creative ways. If Grete Liotsky's Frankfurt Kitchen is a managed space of regulated moving bodies, a space of ergonomics, if the unit for professional single women that she designed enabled a new way of life for women, and both of them liquidated traditional enclosure and domesticity, I would say that then women's resistance in Gestapo prison commits their voices heard in discrete Morse code, from plumbing to spatial memory. To remember is to resist, so that the sacrifices of those who fought against fascism was not in vain.